Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the launch of Governing, a Singapore Perspective, a book written by Professor S Jayakumar, a former minister, law dean and diplomat, and a man who over the course of 30 years has helped write the Singapore story. I'm Michelle Martin. I'm a presenter with Money FM 89.3, and as a journalist for the last 20 years, I've shared interviews with you with some of the world's top authors. Today, we're coming to you live from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the launch of a book that takes us to the inner workings of government and dives deep into a discussion of some of the most pressing issues of our time. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube on the Straits Times live stream, a warm welcome. You are just in time to hear from a leader who's helmed the ministries of Labour and Law, Home Affairs, Foreign Affairs, a man who was our 6th Deputy Prime Minister and who in his career has worked with all 3 of Singapore's Prime Ministers. Ladies and gentlemen, to give us a sense of his book, Governing, please welcome warmly the man of the hour, Professor S Jayakumar.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. Guest of Honor, Eng Heng, Sir Vivian Balakrishnan, and friends and members of the MFA family. I've had a few book launches before, and I must say this is totally different from the previous ones, which had larger audiences. As you know, it's because of the rules applicable for such events during this time of COVID. I want to start off first by thanking Eng Heng, friend and colleague in Cabinet before, for doing the honors of gracing this book launch. I also want to thank Mr. Vivian Balakrishnan and Permanent Secretary of Foreign Affairs and all the team in MFA for the tremendous support that they've given me in the run-up to the book, as well as for preparing this book launch under the auspices of the MFA Diplomatic Academy, together with Straits Times Press. As I explained in my preface, this book actually had a long gestation period, conceived of in 2015 and started work on it in 2016. It had to be put on the back burner a few times because other events and tasks took priority. Minister Vivian Balakrishnan and the government asked me to take charge of the preparations for Singapore's case when Malaysia instituted proceeding for revision of the Pedra Branca judgment. And when Dr. Mahathir came into power, it was discontinued. Prof. Tomiko and I had spent some time writing a book about the unheard cases because it never went to the court, together with Lionel Yee. And when that was over, Ui Boon of Straits Times Press urged me to do a revised edition of my book on diplomacy, and that took some time. So finally, when there was the lockdown or stay-home period of COVID, that gave me time to reflect as well as to finish writing of the book. Now, several friends as well as people from the media asked me when they read the book, Prof, what is the lesson you want to give Singaporeans? And honestly, when I began writing the book, it was never my intention to give a lesson to Singaporeans. I've been in politics long enough to know that Singaporeans don't like to be told lessons. I don't like preaching by ex-ministers or ministers. Natural. So those of us who are parents will know that when we tell our kids how it was way back in our time, the eyes glaze over, right? So it was not my intention to write any stories, lessons. But as I sit back and when I finish the book, I guess I can best describe the book as my invitation to Singaporean readers to come with me on a walk through, a journey, as it were, into behind the scenes workings or some of the workings of government, and try to lift the veil of mystery that some people may have as to how do the different organs of the government work? How does cabinet meet? When the urgent issues, how do they make decisions? And it's interesting that some of the friends who have read the book or advanced copy of the books gave me their feedback along these lines, and I'll just quote 2 or 3. One friend said, "You have done a wonderful service to demystify the business of governing, and I hope it will be widely read, especially the young ones in our midst." Another comment was, "Your book will be a useful reference to readers to understand the amount of efforts needed at all levels to keep the running of Singapore." And a third comment, "It deserves to be read widely. Readers will not only enjoy your personal accounts, but be educated on how Singapore has worked and what we all need to do to keep it working well." So, if the majority of readers who go through the book feel that, to some extent, I have indeed demystified some aspects of governing of Singapore, then that gives me some satisfaction. As I said just now, most people don't like to be preached to. But the reality is that there are some key facts that will always be with us. I mean, every school child knows we are small, without resources, but that we have achieved this degree of success is really a remarkable success story. Can we keep it going? And I want to share with you that in 1988, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when he gave me a copy of his first memoir, he inscribed in it, "Jaya, keep the Singapore story going." Keep the Singapore story going. In the year 2000, his second memoir, he autographed it this way, "To Jaya, you have to contribute to the sequel to the Singapore story." So, how to keep the story going? How to write a sequel? Cannot be me, or cannot be a Prime Minister and the ministers. As I see it, and I hope the flavor comes through the book, it requires all of us, really. I have indicated in the book some of the dark clouds that are looming on the horizon. So the question is, can we keep the story going? I believe we can. I'm confident we can. But we have to remember the reason why we are here is because of exceptionalism. And I don't mean exceptionalism at just one level. Exceptionalism at all levels. We need competent, good quality people in the leadership, in private sector, public sector, at all levels. And most importantly, exceptionalism in our people, which we have fortunately had. You can have exceptional leaders, you can have exceptional civil servants, private sector, but you need a population, a populace that is astute, aware of what's going on in the world, aware of what's going on in the region, and therefore, together with everybody else, comes to a conclusion that this place has had a success story and is well worth our combined effort together to keep the Singapore story going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaya. If you've just joined us from home, welcome. I'm Michelle Martin here with a small but distinguished group at the launch of the book Governing, written by Professor S Jayakumar. It's great to have you with us. Now, the book itself is going to be on sale from tomorrow, and all proceeds are going to go to MFA's adopted charity, the Rainbow Center. Next, we're going to hear from a man that took just one day to read this book. It took me a few days, but it took him one day. So please welcome our guest of honor, who's also clearly a speed reader, Minister for Defense, Dr. Ng Hen.
Thank you, Michelle. First, I'm very happy to be here and honored to speak at the launch of Professor Jayakumar's book. My colleagues, Minister Balakrishnan, SMS Cheong Tat, Permsex, AG, and distinguished guests and dear friends. You heard some preambulatory remarks from the man of the hour, but you would also know that this is his fifth book, and one in which he has just told us, in which the circuit breaker period, as he says, is a blessing in disguise, earlier this year helped bring to fruition. In his preface, Prof, we call him Prof, good friends call him Prof, tells us that this book was not written for, quote, professors, lawyers, diplomats, or ministers, but for the man in the street, unquote. After reading it, I think he has abundantly succeeded, and the book will have mass appeal as you wanted. But in my view, it also ought to be required reading for people in the vocations mentioned, certainly for political aspirants and civil servants. It's well worth the read. Let me proffer 3 reasons for my recommendation. First, the fount. Prof. Jaya belongs to that generation who can personally recount in intimate detail the course of Singapore's development from pre-independence to the present. As you've heard, he's worked with all 3 Singapore Prime Ministers. His first encounter with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, as he described in the book, was as a law student at the then University of Singapore in 1962. It was a forum organized by the Students' Union, and he was chairman of the council. And that meeting included luminaries like Mr. David Marshall, Mr. Ong Eng Guan, among others. Professor's own storied political and diplomatic career spans an astonishing 40 years, beginning in 1971 as Singapore's Perm Rep to the UN to 2011 when he retired as senior minister. I think there are very few like him who have been in the thick of the action or had ringside seats to Singapore's political struggles across such a lengthy period. It is no wonder then that Prof writes with authenticity and authority, not vicariously bestowed by position, but as a first-hand witness of those events. That intimacy with issues, events, and persons makes for an absorbing read. The reader gets transported as if he or she were beside the author, up close and personal in these encounters. I particularly like that the anecdotes and vignettes are meticulously researched, so no ambiguity can cloud either the description of the main event or the impressions conveyed. My second reason is the man, or more precisely, his nature. Our thoughts, verbalized and more so written down, reflect who we are and from where we look. In Plato's allegory, all chained in that cave are biased in their perceptions of reality. I've known Prof for nearly 20 years. First as a neophyte when he was already a minister, then Deputy Prime Minister and Senior Minister, now retired and advisor. I count him a close friend and fearsome golf kaki. If ever there was one who could break free from the chains that prevent us from seeing reality as it is, it would be the dear professor. He has no axe to grind, no point to prove, no lofty ambitions that craves to be fulfilled, and is not one who bears grudges. His training as a lawyer and diplomat shapes his discourse, both socially and in serious forums. Brief, to the point, no hyperbole, or unsubstantiated assertions, with caveats when necessary for precision, coupled with a prodigious memory and a searing intellect. These qualities not only translate to reliable accounts, but also convey the core of the issues, challenges, and events distilled in this book. The third reason is motivation. Why write another book? A fifth in 9 years, in his 9th decade of life, no less. Prof does not say so explicitly in his book. He's given some remarks about that. I don't think it's his nature to do so. As he says, he doesn't like to sound preachy. All he has accorded us by way of motivation is this nondescript line in his preface. Quote, hope that the insights that the book offers on diverse issues and the workings of the government are of interest, unquote. Even the title, Governing, a Singapore Perspective, leaves the placid lake with hardly a ripple. Quite a contrast from, say, Mr. Lee's hard truths to keep Singapore going. The approach is different, but my belief is that Professor's intent is similar, not only to inform, sometimes entertain, but ultimately to leave with the reader the seminal truths and choices Singapore and Singaporeans must make to master their own future. This book does not shy away from provocative issues, as long as they are core to Singapore's existence and well-being. He dives headlong into the relations of the judiciary, the Attorney General and the government, the death penalty, Section 377A, Lee family disputes, the elected presidency, and the 4G succession. This book is not just tales of a raconteur, but an exegesis of past events and present challenges that we must confront to chart the best way ahead. So I've given 3 solid reasons to pick up his book. It's an easy read. I finish it from cover to cover in a day because it's written for pleasant reading and you can breeze through many of the anecdotes. I believe you will find more reasons to commend it to your friends after doing so. Let me end on a personal note. Prof, by any account, these autumn years for you have been quite exceptional. In the last few years, you've written 5 books, gained 6 grandchildren, and played the best golf games ever. I should know as I paid to watch those games. This year, you were also awarded Singapore's highest national award. As I reflect on your autumn years, these post-retirement years have allowed you to be a devoted husband, a doting grandfather, a trusted advisor to the government, and a loyal friend, among other roles. I also know that if it were not for her health, Lalita would be here at this launch, the inseparable constant in your many years together. We continue to pray for her recovery. Thank you for this book, and may you never slow down.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ng. Gentlemen, I invite you to put your masks back on. Right now, Professor Jayakumar will present a signed copy of the book Governing to our guest of honor, Minister for Defense, Dr. Ng Eng Hen, and this represents the launch of the book Governing. Warm round of applause, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Ng. All right, it's time for our book chat. It's an honor to sit across you, Professor. Thank you very much for giving us insight to your book that's only going to be available tomorrow, so readers at home are getting exclusive insight.
Yes.
I'm going to start with political succession. There's a line in your book where you say, "We should not change horses midstream." Interesting. We know that PM Lee has announced his intention to step down as Prime Minister before he turns 70. He has said that this recent GE will be the last that he will lead as Prime Minister, and he's also said he's determined to hand over Singapore in good working order to the next team. He is now 68. So do you think that the COVID pandemic impacts this timeline of succession in any way?
If I may just, for the viewers who have yet to read the book, explain that I recount meeting PM Lee before COVID, and I gave him feedback from many friends, as well as I said, taxi drivers who I have rides with, who were disappointed that he had announced that he planned to retire at such timelines. And many had asked, why did he announce that when he has 1-2 terms fit enough to be PM? Why did he announce it when the line of succession identity was not known? I gave him the feedback at one of the lunches we had, but he was aware of the feedback, and his response was that the later he put it off, the older he will be, the older the potential successors will be. It was clear to me that he did not want to hang on to power longer than necessary. But that was before COVID. And actually, I was persuaded by his explanation, which I conveyed to those who had asked me to have a word with him. But I think COVID-19 has changed the situation. As I describe it, I consider the present situation to be one of the most dangerous or perilous stages of Singapore that I've ever seen. The light at the end of the tunnel is not there. Hopefully, if it's 1 or 2 years, then as PM Lee has shown flexibility that he will see the crisis through. But what I am doing in my book is to have a what-if question. What if the COVID pandemic in Singapore and in the world does not abate and the crisis lingers on, both in terms of health danger as well as economic problems for 3-4 years closer to the next elections? What if? And the point I made in the book was, I don't think it is wise to talk of succession in such a situation. It is akin to a long drawn-out war. So I posed the question that in that kind of scenario, maybe PM might have to review the timelines, the second timeline of not wanting to lead the next elections. So that's the question I posed. That's why I said maybe it's not wise to change horses in midstream. And I think it's an entirely new situation. And question and the criterion must be what is in the best interest of Singapore. So I was posing that question for everybody to consider. I do not know whether Prime Minister Lee is amenable to the idea if and when that situation occurs.
So he's aware of your viewpoint. But what about the 4G leaders? Do you know what they think of your opinion?
No. I've sent them copies of my book for them to read over the weekend. I really do not know what their view is. But if I may give a view on the spot, I don't think that they are rushing to take the top spot. Then I don't think they're in a great haste. And I'm also confident that they're competent and intelligent people. I'm sure that if the question is considered by them at that time, they will be guided also by what is in the best interest of Singapore. But honestly, I do not know what their reaction is.
Well, speaking of the 4G leaders, Prof, what do you think of the 4G leaders' handling of the pandemic so far?
I think they have done a good job, really, and I say so in my book. Particularly considering the barrage of criticisms that came when, you remember that episode over the migrant workers' dormitories, there was a lapse, and that brought a ton of criticisms. People who previously had praised Singapore, now praises turned to criticisms. Singapore was a failure, we lost its shine, and so on. So I was really concerned how this would affect the 4G. Would they be flustered, as well as the frontline workers in the hospitals? And I was very cheered that the 4G went on with their briefings, transparent with the public on the figures, on cases, whether they were going up, down, and they were not fazed by this barrage of criticism. And on the whole, I think they've done a good job. And that's why I say in my book that far from a story of failure, actually, there are many success stories to be told about the way Singapore handled the COVID crisis. Of course, the danger is not over yet.
Yes, and if I could look around the corner with you, Professor, what challenges do you think COVID poses to the government and to the people of Singapore?
Well, going back to what I said earlier, we are in a dangerous situation. You can look at COVID just as another pandemic, but it's a pandemic that is really unparalleled. We can take whatever measures in Singapore to bring the numbers down. We have brought it down, community cases and so on. But it is a situation which has so many facets. It affects lives, safety and health of people. It has tremendous impact on the economy, as everybody knows. Jobs and livelihoods are at stake. It's even disrupted the normal fabric of society. Take this event, for example. Right? We have to do things differently. Families have to adjust. When I met the journalists, I gave a very small example of how we are so used to having birthday parties. My wife celebrated birthday. I have 6 grandchildren who all used to come at the same time, but we could not. So there are 2 little birthday celebrations in the house. I mean, this is just a small example, but there are more serious disruptions to families and people. And the other facet of it is the success with which we can tackle the problem is not really completely in our hands. It is so much dependent on the effectiveness and successes of other countries. And just when we think other countries have gotten over the curve, you see cities and countries having a second wave, lockdown, and so on. So I've drawn the parallel that this is like a guerrilla war, but maybe if I had to write the book again, in a sense, you almost have an equivalent of Third World War, where all the countries have to deal with a war-like situation. So it's a dangerous situation.
Well, if you could take a big picture look at Singapore's political future, in the book you outline 4 possible future scenarios following GE 2020. Now, which of these 4 scenarios that you lay out in the book most concerns you, Prof?
Yes, of the which scenario concerns me most?
Yes.
I think the least desirable of the scenarios would be what I referred to as revolving door scenarios. And a revolving door scenario is where governments come in with a narrow majority of a few seats. And the next government comes in, the opposition party comes in, also with a handful of seats. Why is that a least desirable situation? Because for Singapore, given our situation, we need a strong government. I leave aside BAP or whatever. We need a strong government. We cannot have a revolving door situation because such a government that comes in with a handful of seats will be a weak government. A weak government that will be looking over its shoulder and worrying about whether they can win the next election. So there will be no political appetite, there will be no political courage and vision to look at long-term problems. And the truth is, to govern Singapore, you have to tackle immediate situations as well as look at problems over the horizon. To give a good example, climate change. Climate change, to really tackle climate change, you have to take measures, adaptation and mitigation measures, which will benefit, the fruits of which can be seen 1 or 2 generations ahead. And there will be some political cost and economic cost for some industries if you want to put in the necessary measures. But if you're just squeaked in with a handful of votes, the government is likely to say, let's not worry about that, let's worry about winning the next elections. So that's why a revolving door situation is what I think is not good for Singapore. Yes.
So let's talk about some issues that this book gives us the context for understanding, and I think that's why I enjoyed reading your book. You're a law professor for years, you've been one, and so you distill for us, complex ideas about the law that help us make our own minds about contemporary issues. For example, in the book you discuss the various roles of the organs of state that uphold matters of law and order in Singapore. These include the Ministry of Law, the Attorney General's chambers, as well as the judiciary. So first up, generally, which misperceptions or misconceptions did you think it important to clarify about our organs of state? And specifically, with the Parti Liani case, do you think that this case raises important questions about access to justice and the impartiality of the many organs of state that were involved in this case?
You have some important parts of that question. One is a more broad question about the administration of justice, and a more specific question, though related, on the recent May case. And both were subject of a parliament sitting, I think, yesterday. Mr. Shanmugam gave a lengthy speech. Now, let me deal with a broader question first. I'll start off by saying that our system of administration of justice has been one of the cornerstones of Singapore's reputation and success. The impartiality, the reliability, the effectiveness of our administration of justice. And administration of justice involves several agencies, the police, the Attorney General's chambers, Ministry of Law, and the judiciary. I wrote a chapter in the book on the relationship between AGC, Ministry of Law, and the judiciary. And that was the first chapter that I drafted when I began this book in 2016. So it had nothing to do with this case, although I edited and updated it later. And the point I make in that case is about how this independence of the judiciary is so critical for Singapore, and how the impartiality and the integrity of the administration of justice is a key tenet for Singapore. I gave an example. I just wish to mention to viewers, I gave an example, for instance, of how one morning I got a call from former Chief Justice Yong Pang Hao, said that some of his judges are complaining that members of parliament are writing letters, meet the people session letters to the judges. Can my resident have a lenient sentence, or and so on. And rightly so, the judges were upset. So I described how seriously I took this, the government took this, and how we wrote to the MPs that they should not do it. That's just a small example. The bigger point is this, that the importance of an impartial administration of justice is something that has been ingrained, I would say, as a DNA of all prime ministers and cabinets subsequently. And every prime minister reminds ministers, and all the ministers are aware of this. So that is an important general point I want to make. About the recent Maid case, I think there's a few questions here which have arisen. One is the complaint or perception that there was some lapses. Second, the complaint or allegation that there was a departure from the principle of impartiality, or that there was some undue influence. Mr. Shanmugam gave a lengthy statement yesterday, comprehensive statement, where he went to all the facts and gave a very detailed explanation. On the issue of whether there were lapses, he said that yes, there were some lapses, and that they're going to be looked into. The more important question is, was there absence of departure from the principle of impartiality, and was there undue influence? And if you read his statement, he made it clear and explained why this was not so. He pointed out that the prosecution actually had good grounds to institute the prosecution. He made that clear in a very detailed statement. And he also brought out enough information to point out that there was no undue influence. I was not there in Parliament, but from what I read and from what I understand, even the opposition members of Parliament confirmed that they were not alleging that there was undue influence. Then there was a point raised that because of the relationship that the Attorney General had with Mr. Liu Man Leong, dating back almost 2 decades ago, because there was this relationship, they had sat on the same board of a company, that perhaps that cozy relationship had an impact and influence in the decision to prosecute. That has also been made very clear in the statement yesterday. It was not so. In fact, what was disclosed was that the Attorney General, in fact, had resigned from the company as a result of some disagreement with Mr. Liu Man Leong. So these 2 points I thought I should make. But may I add 1 or 2 other points? One is this question of relationships. No, Michelle, we are in a very small country. And it's inevitable that in a small country like Singapore, you'll have various relationships which are formed, you know. You might have studied together, you might have done NS together, you might have been in university together, or you might have worked, or your families might have known each other, you might have a lawyer-client relationship, a doctor-patient relationship, inevitable. So it was made clear in Parliament yesterday that there was not that close relationship or cozy relationship. But the point is, the broader point is this: it is not the relationship that is so important, but whatever the relationship, when you are holding a particular position, when it comes to having to make a decision in official capacity affecting the rights of someone or the liberty of someone or which will have legal consequences, does that person do so objectively on the merits of the case, impartially, and in accordance with the law? That is critical, and that has been a key tenet of Singapore. I thought I mentioned that. Finally, I have been thinking about the controversy about this case, and perhaps we should put some things in context. If I were to put it in context, we should bear in mind that we have some. Before I go further, on the relationships, it was mentioned in Parliament, and it is so. Mr. Shanmugam mentioned that Prof. Jaya, when he was minister, had such relationships. The Commissioner of Police, when I was Home Affairs Minister, was my colleague in law school. And his successor as Commissioner of Police was my student, right? And a few of the Chief Justices were my contemporaries in the university. Attorney General Lucien Wong was my student. So it's not the relationship, but how we go about administering and executing our official role. To round up this part about the maids, we have 250,000 plus maids, domestic helpers. So equivalent number almost of the employers. The unique nature of domestic helpers is that they live with the family of the employer. So they're vulnerable. And rightly so, people are concerned about the vulnerability of domestic maids. But the flip side of it, which sometimes is forgotten, is that the people that the domestic worker cares for are also vulnerable. The elderly, the bedridden, the tiny kids under the care. So sometimes we need to have this. The second thing in context is we tend to forget majority of domestic workers are law-abiding and do the work properly. Minority of domestic workers are off-site. They may ill-treat the people under their charge, or they may steal or whatever. the majority of employers are also good to their domestic workers. A minority of employers are bad. They ill-treat. So when a domestic worker or the employer is offside the law has to take its course, and the authorities have to prosecute both. So I thought I should put matters in perspective.
Well, thank you for taking the question. It is a contentious issue. Okay. I want to switch gears now and talk about the U.S. elections. Oh. It's been a contentious U.S. election so far, and it looks like a litigious one as well.
Since from the media, what's the latest?
I can't give you the exact number because I've been off for a couple of hours. But we do have a president of the U.S. saying he will use courts to stop the counting of votes, saying he will take election disputes to the Supreme Court. So what do you think, Prof? Could the U.S. elections impact the stability of American democracy? And what would that mean for the world and for us, Singapore in particular?
Your first part of let me take the second part of your question. How will it affect Singapore? As of now, we do not know who is actually going to be the president. But how U.S. domestic politics and how the presidential elections or any presidential elections affect Singapore, I would say that we have been fortunate to have had very good relationships with the United States over the years, regardless of whether it's a Democratic president or Republican president. I think Minister Vivian and our ambassador, Professor Tommy Koh, who's ambassador in the United States, will bear that out. It has been, I think it's a very satisfying outcome that we have managed to have relations with both Republican and Democratic administrations. That's because of the mutuality of common interests in so many areas. And I hope that will continue regardless of who is finally the winner in this recent election. How will it affect the stability of the world? I think it will have an impact in this way. Whatever happens in the final result, I think it's fair to say the United States is fractured, it's divided, and highly polarized. There's no doubt about that. I think a divided United States means that it will not be able to provide the leadership in world affairs that many of its friends would expect and hope for the United States to provide. I'm reminded, and Mr. Bivin reminded me of the good adage that foreign policy actually begins at home. In other words, you got to act together and be united, stable, successful at home before you can be an effective player on the scene. In fact, that applies to smaller countries as well. So I think that is how I'll answer your question about the United States elections. But I'm saddened, really, to see what's going on there. I think all of us are gripped to the TV. I'm saddened because of what I mentioned just now. I have an affinity for the United States because I've studied and worked there and lived there. I hope that there can be a period of healing and restoration of stability. But the process of the elections has also been quite disheartening. I mean, the United States is portrayed as a beacon of democracy. I think that aura has taken a little bit of beating in this with the nature of the elections, hurling of insults and diatribe, and also crowds gathering outside counting centers, people with arms, almost as it were intimidating the counting. I could not imagine that this is really happening in the United States. So when I look at what's happening in the United States, I ask myself, and I hope others ask themselves, what lessons are there in it for Singapore? I mean, the rancor and the bitterness in the society there compared to social cohesion and unity in our society. Can what happens in the United States happen in Singapore? The answer to that is yes. So I think what we have here is something quite precious. We should really not take it for granted. It can happen in a big country, it can happen in a small country. So I think we should really make sure it doesn't happen here.
So one more question on the US elections. You refer in your book to a new Cold War between the US and China. How do you think the outcome of these elections could impact that relationship, US-China relations?
It's difficult to say, but I do not think that Cold War will evaporate if there's a Biden presidency, because from what I have learned and observed, the concern and fear and suspicions of China are not just that of the Republican Party. There seems to be more or less a shared bipartisan view that China is to be feared as a strategic competitor. Maybe under a Biden presidency, you may find less sharp, less strident flavor to the Cold War. I'm not sure it will go away suddenly. Let's hope for the best, because with this Cold War, it poses problems for all other countries, because both sides will want to get others to line up on one side or the other.
All right. Well, just to give people a sense of the book, it covers so much, big picture issues, macro issues, and domestic issues as well. So when it comes to the Lee Kuan Yew family feud, not many people might know, but you write in your book that you were approached by a respected senior lawyer who thought that you might act as a mediator. Now, had you mediated, what would you have done?
I really don't know, because we didn't get to that stage. As you see from the book, I was reluctant, because I said that the genie had gotten out of the bottle. How are you going to put it back? But I was very concerned how this whole saga impacted on Singapore. So if I could play a role, I told senior counsel, and I mentioned his name, Jiam Chin Toon, that sure, if it's felt I can play a part, I'm happy to. But for your viewers, maybe I should explain how mediation is different from other kinds of dispute settlement like courts and so on, or arbitration. Because a mediator cannot make a decision. He doesn't make a decision. Secondly, it's away from the glare of publicity. It's all behind closed doors. And the task of the mediator is to bring the parties together to see whether there's room for quiet resolution of the matter. So a mediator can only put suggestions. He doesn't decide. But even that would have been a pretty Herculean task given the atmosphere. So that's why I said, before we do anything, told my friend Jiam Chin Toon that I only consider it if all the parties expressly agree to my role. But it didn't go past that. And I was very relieved that it didn't go past that. But I guess, I would have done my best if the parties had wanted it.
All right, I have one final question. I'm a journalist, so I can't stop asking questions. So this is my final question for you. In Chapter 4, on your reflections on legal matters, you share your thoughts on specific issues, from the death penalty to caning to the question of repealing Section 377A of the Penal Code. And you say you expect laws to evolve over time. Can you elaborate? Also, I understand that journalists came up to you and asked you what your thoughts are on referendums on issues like this. So,
Referendums?
Yes.
Both as a politician and as a person with legal background, I feel that the way to look at laws is that they are not static, they're not cast in stone. Laws, to a large extent, reflect evolving values and expectations of a society as to what is or what it should be proper, improper, acceptable, not acceptable, legitimate, illegitimate. These vary from societies to societies, from time to time. They evolve. They evolve due to various factors, because of changing times or changing international moods and so on. So that's why governments must be prepared from time to time to take a look at various areas of the law. And this is what we do in Singapore. You'll find that periodically ministers of law go to Parliament to have law reforms. Now, you're asking me exactly how it will evolve. I do not know, because it is, you can't say or state that by year X we'll be able to change this law. The government needs to have a good feel of the pulse of society. And we are not a homogeneous society. We are heterogeneous. We have different racial, religious groups, and views may vary from group to group. It may also vary from age group to older group. Yes, on this question, one of the journalist colleagues did ask me about, on such issues, would you consider that the best way is to have a referendum? And I must just mention what I said. I don't believe that you should govern by referendums. It's not practical. You're elected by the people to govern for X number of years. You have the mandate. And your job is to govern, and you should try to do the best possible job, bearing in mind what you consider the best interests of the people. If you've done a reasonably good job, then the results in the next election should speak for itself. But you cannot please, Michelle, you cannot please all the people all the time. So the task, the art of government is to be able for the government to assess what is in the best interest of the country, but still politically viable. You need to assess the political cost. You need to assess whether it's the right thing to do. So many different factors. So you cannot have referendums on everything. The Constitution provides for referendums on very, very critical issues like whether you merge with another country and so on. But that's my view. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jayakumar. A round of applause for the author, Professor Jayakumar.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here with us today, and to our viewers at home, I hope you've enjoyed your time with us. The book will be available tomorrow. All proceeds are going to the Rainbow Center, the charity, so go out and get the book tomorrow. I'm Michelle Martin. Until our next book chat, goodbye.